lady from beneath the sandalwood tree here. And let's talk about something a little more sinister than usual. Imagine this. A prominent human rights activist boards a plane on his way to study abroad and continue his fight for justice. Sounds like a noble journey, right? But what if that flight was his last? Munir Saeed Thalib, a man who dedicated his life to exposing corruption and holding powerful people accountable, was poisoned mid-air with a lethal dose of arsenic. The flight crew thought he was just sick, but this wasn't some random medical emergency. This was a deliberate, calculated murder on a commercial airliner. And what makes it even more chilling is who was eventually found guilty: a pilot from the very airline he was flying on. Munir wasn't just some guy on a plane. He was a force of nature in a country where speaking out against the powerful could be a death sentence. As the chairman of the Commission for the Disappeared and Victims Violence Management Board and executive director of Imparcial, he was a relentless human rights advocate. He wasn't afraid to take on the military or the government or anyone else who abused their power. He was a lawyer who fought for the disappeared, the tortured, and the silenced. He'd received death threats, had a bomb planted outside his home, and yet he never backed down. He was a man with a target on his back, a target that was so big and so brazen that they came for him not in some dark alley, but in the middle of a flight, surrounded by strangers, 35,000 feet in the air. But this wasn't just a random act of violence. The man who orchestrated this, Polikarpus Prianto, was a pilot for the very same airline. And he didn't just stumble into this. The official motive, as stated in the court documents, was his belief that Munir's human rights work was a hindrance to government programs. In other words, he believed he was doing the right thing. He saw Munir not as a person, but as a problem to be eliminated, a roadblock to what he considered a greater good. This was a man so consumed by his twisted sense of duty that he would go so far as to change his flight to intercept Munir, all to carry out a cold, calculated, and frankly evil plan. He didn't just kill a man. He murdered an idea, a voice, all for a belief that he was helping the system that he served. Polikarpus's plan was meticulous. He didn't just happen to be on the same flight. He had been actively tracking Munir, waiting for the perfect moment. He knew Munir was traveling to the Netherlands, a long-haul flight that would provide ample opportunity. And so he rearranged his own schedule, creating a bogus flight change request to ensure he was on the same plane, a Garuda Indonesia flight to Amsterdam, with a stopover in Singapore. He had his target, he had his location, and he had a plan that would turn a routine trip into a tomb in the sky. All the pieces were in place, and what happened next was a chilling testament to how far he was willing to go to silence a man who spoke too loudly for justice. That chapter right there is exactly what you need to understand. This wasn't an opportunistic crime. This was a plan, years in the making. And the next chapter in this macabre saga begins on September 6, 2004, when Polikarpus, a pilot, swapped his flight from Peking to Jakarta, Singapore on flight GA974. He didn't just ask nicely either. He created a fake special mission to get on that flight. Why? Because that was Munir's flight. He was setting the stage, stepping into the scene of the crime, and, unbeknownst to everyone else on board, he was about to make a seat change that would seal the fate of one of Indonesia's most courageous men. He had his flight, and he had his target. Now all he needed was the opportunity. As Munir settled into his economy seat for the long flight, Polikarpus made his move. He approached Munir and, in a seemingly generous gesture, offered him his business class seat. This wasn't an act of kindness. It was a strategic move. The business class cabin was smaller, with fewer people, giving Polikarpus the space and isolation he needed to carry out his heinous plan. Munir, a man who had faced countless threats, likely saw this as a simple human courtesy, never suspecting that this offer of comfort was, in fact, an invitation to his own death. And with that simple exchange, the final act of this tragedy began to unfold. Now the scene is set. As the other passengers were settling in, a flight attendant went through the cabin preparing the welcome drinks for business class. This was it, the moment Polikarpus had been waiting for. With Munir now seated in the private sanctuary of business class, a place he only had access to because of the very man who was about to kill him, the opportunity was perfect. There, in the small, quiet galley of the plane, out of sight from the other passengers, the flight attendant placed a small tray with a selection of drinks. And on that tray was the glass of orange juice that would become Munir's last. Now, picture this. Polikarpus, a man who had dedicated his life to an airline, calmly walked into the pantry area. He wasn't there for a snack or a chat. He was there to commit murder. He had a fatal dose of arsenic poison ready, and he knew exactly where to put it. He'd done his homework. He knew that Munir, a man of simple tastes, didn't drink alcohol. So when the flight attendant offered a choice of beverages, he knew Munir would pick the orange juice. With cold precision, he slipped the poison into the glass, ensuring that his target would never see it coming. He didn't just kill a man, he tainted a simple, everyday act, transforming an innocent drink into a vessel of death. And just like that, the fate of Munir was sealed. A flight attendant, completely unaware of the poison lurking in the glass, innocently placed the drink in front of him. Munir, a man who had faced down powerful adversaries and never backed down, saw no reason to suspect this simple act of hospitality. He picked up the glass and, with a drink that should have been a refreshing start to his journey, he consumed the fatal dose. He drank his own death, served to him by a man he had just met, on a plane that was meant to carry him to a new chapter of his life, not end the one he was in. But a monster's work is never done until they see the end result. After the flight attendant served the drinks, Polikarpus didn't just walk away. He stayed. He watched. An unsettling presence in the peaceful business class cabin to make sure Munir drank the juice. He watched as the man he had just poisoned took that final sip. A man who had no idea that his life's work and his life itself were about to come to a horrific and painful end. The poison, silent and swift, would soon begin its work, and Munir's fight for justice would be over. Just a quarter of an hour after the plane took off from Singapore, the silence of the business class cabin was broken by a horrifying sound. Munir, the man who had just shared a polite conversation with the pilot who would ultimately be convicted of his murder, began to feel a terrible, agonizing sickness. He started to vomit violently. The poison, a silent and insidious killer, had started its work. What began as a seemingly innocent trip was now a medical emergency, a race against time for a man who didn't even know he was in a race at all. And Polycarpus? He watched, his horrific plan unfolding just as he had intended. His condition rapidly worsened, and the flight crew, now in a panic, sprang into action. They moved him to the more spacious business class cabin and called for medical assistance. As luck, or perhaps grim irony, would have it, there was a doctor on board. The doctor immediately began to attend to him, administering medication and trying to figure out what was happening. But no one, not the crew, not the doctor, and certainly not Munir, had any idea what was really happening. They were trying to save a man who wasn't just sick, but who had been poisoned with one of the most deadly substances on Earth while 35,000 feet in the air. Just 2 hours before the plane was due to land in Amsterdam, the unthinkable happened. Munir passed away. The autopsy and forensic reports from both the Netherlands and Indonesia confirmed the grim truth. A lethal concentration of arsenic was found in his body, and traces of the poison were even found on his vomit-stained clothes. His murder was now undeniable, the horrific proof literally written on his body. The brave human rights activist who fought tirelessly for others was silenced, not by some grand conspiracy in the shadows, but by a simple act of poisoning on a plane, leaving a trail of questions and a world of grief in its wake. And so, the final act played out not in the sky, but in a courtroom. After a long and complicated trial, the public prosecutor's demands were met. The pilot, Polycarpus Budihari Prianto, was found guilty of the premeditated murder of Munir under Article 340 of the Criminal Code. He was also convicted of forgery of documents for the fake mission that got him on that flight in the first place. The justice system, after a horrific crime that reached 35,000 feet into the air, finally came down and delivered a verdict, holding one man responsible for silencing a voice that had dared to speak out against the powerful. Then came the shocking turn that left many stunned. In December 2005, a court had found Polycarpus guilty and sentenced him to a staggering 14 years in prison. It seemed like justice had finally been served, but the story was far from over. In October 2006, just a year later, a 3-member panel of judges at the Supreme Court annulled his conviction, citing insufficient evidence. The man found guilty of cold-blooded murder was now a free man, with the exception of a 2-year jail term for forging the documents that got him on the flight. It was a twist that angered human rights activists and left many wondering if the powerful forces Munir fought against had once again won. But just when it seemed all hope was lost, and the powerful had once again gotten away with murder, a sliver of justice emerged from the shadows.
On January 25, 2007, the Attorney General's office took a rare and courageous step, filing for a judicial review of the case. This was an unprecedented move, a challenge to the Supreme Court's own decision. It was a sign that the fight for Munir wasn't over. A year later, on January 24, 2008, the Supreme Court reopened the case and, in a unanimous verdict, found Polikarpus guilty of premeditated murder. The sentence that had been annulled was now replaced with a far more severe one, 20 years in prison. Munir's widow, Suciwati, had been fighting an uphill battle for years, and while she believed he deserved an even longer sentence, she knew that this was a crucial step in holding the true masterminds accountable, and a testament to the fact that Munir's legacy, his fight for justice, would not be silenced.
Just when it seemed like a small measure of justice had finally been served, the dark tendrils of power began to tighten their grip once more. The man convicted, Polikarpus, filed for a judicial review of his 20-year sentence. And in a stunning reversal that felt like a slap in the face to Munir's family and everyone who fought for him, the Supreme Court, on October 2, 2013, slashed his sentence from 20 years down to 14. For Munir's widow, Suciwati, who had already endured so much, this wasn't just a reduction in time, it was a devastating step back. A stark reminder that even after a hard-won victory, the fight against impunity was far from over. And then, the final gut-wrenching blow. After a hard-won judicial review, the man who had stolen a hero from the world and left a family shattered received a total of 50 months of sentence cuts. This meant that while he was originally due for release in 2022, the government made him eligible for parole in 2014, and in November of that year, Polikarpus walked out of prison a free man. To Munir's wife, Suciwati, and the activists who had spent a decade fighting for a small measure of justice, it was an unimaginable betrayal. The man who had ended the life of the person she loved, the man who had systematically planned her husband's murder, was now free, while her husband was forever gone. The pain and the injustice of it all culminated on August 29, 2018, when Polikarpus officially completed his parole and was declared completely free, a final, unceremonious end to the public pursuit of justice. And so, this dark chapter ends, not with justice served, but with a chilling warning. The documents reveal that the killing of Munir was no random act. It was a cold, calculated, and premeditated murder. His work as a human rights advocate and his criticism of the government were seen as a hindrance by those in power, and for that, he was silenced. The real tragedy of this case is not just the loss of a hero, but the stark, undeniable truth that those who ordered his death were never truly held accountable. Munir's case stands as a painful reminder that even in the pursuit of a just society, the most powerful forces can often operate with impunity, leaving a trail of questions and shattered trust in their wake. His legacy, however, lives on as a beacon for those who continue to fight for human rights and democracy, a symbol that the struggle for justice is never truly over. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of Indonesia's most infamous cases. If you want to support the channel and make sure we can keep bringing you stories like this, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe so you don't miss our next chapter. And let us know in the comments below, what are your thoughts on this tragic crime? Do you think true justice was ever served?